Okay, so everyone, a few people here don't know me, so I'll give you a very quick introduction about myself. 6 years ago, I had a dream to build a school over the cloud, or a perfect educational institution where students and teachers can be equal on the same level. And in the same year, I found out about a startup who's trying to do the same thing. So I joined as a student. They called us founders. They had us build the university with them. Fast forward, they're now ranked first as the top innovative company in Africa by Fast Company. And I worked there on designing engaging co-creative learning experiences for executives of multiple levels as well as undergrad students. 2 years forward, I got introduced to spiral dynamics theory through a book called Reinventing Organizations. Now I know a few people here don't like Kenwell stuff. They find it a bit too dreaming or a bit too out of touch with reality. But like I found this book to be one of the greatest. I did lots of research after that about spiral dynamics theory and its origins. Reinventing Organizations was one of the greatest book in the field of organizational development that's based on spiral dynamics. So I developed this at this point. I developed this obsession with the idea of non-hierarchical organizations, teams, and organizations that function creatively, that function productively, without the need for a central authority, without a need for a leader. You can call them decentralized, you can call them self-organizing, you can call them holocratic, but I had that question of, are there organizations, are there entities, are there groups of people that function effectively without the need for a central authority? A year later, I fell in love with the decentralized paratransit sector in Egypt. I found it a perfect example of that. I dropped out of school. I started a fintech company to serve this sector. The reason I fell in love with that sector, the decentralized mass transit sector, is that I found that it actually matches the organizational elements of what we dream of when we think of a self-organizing organization, or what Frederick Laloux, the author of Reinventing Organizations, would call a teal organization. Um, Particularly, there were three organizational elements that I found met in this sector. Distributed decision making, meaning that there isn't a single person up at the top of the pyramid, at the top of the food chain, who makes the decisions for these uh, for these drivers, for these businesses. They collectively make their decisions, and they quickly respond to market trends and to traffic trends to satisfy the needs of of riders and of users on the ground. Second is self-management. If you look at the structure of these organizations, uh, you wouldn't find middle management, you wouldn't find bosses, you wouldn't find HR or finance or accounting. You'd find that every single business takes care of its part, and they all coordinate with each other to form a route that serves thousands of people in a specific area, and then they complement each other from various places. So that element of self-management was very clear and very obvious in this specific industry. And the third, and most importantly, it's actually an anti-fragile organization, meaning that the organization isn't dependent on specific individuals with with lots of power to shape its course, or to define its direction. There is no major risk taken by trusting and depending on the strategy of those individuals. The organization is ground up, which means it's quite solid and quite flexible and very quick to respond to changes, and very quick to actually innovate and create new routes and alter their course. So those were the three organizational elements and Laloux's uh, framework of field organizations. So if you ever visit Egypt and you decide to move around the city, you can either use a car, a taxi, or if you prefer a more budget option, you will have to use mass transit. Mass transit is getting into a bus with multiple people to go from point A to point B. And for that purpose, you have three options. The first are those large buses operated by the government, by a government program called Cairo Transport Authority in Cairo and Alexandria Passenger Transport Authority in Alexandria. So they buy plenty of big buses and they operate them by a central government bureaucracy um, according to fixed route. They pay the drivers fixed salaries. That's how it goes. The second option you'd have are those mini buses operated by the private sector. All in all, there are around 15 private sector company offering intercity transportation solutions. So if you want to move from point A to point B inside Cairo, you will have to depend on either Cairo Transport Authority, the government, or one of 15 transport companies that usually operate minibuses under license from the government. But the third option that you're most likely going to spend on are those microbuses. They are usually 14-seater buses that operate as micro businesses in the streets of Cairo. They most of the time you find that they're colored white, unbranded. There isn't a company that you can, hold them accountable to, but there is extremely high standardization in the routes and the fare and the details of their offering. So this is what we call paratransit or self-organizing mass transit, the latter form that's formed of microbuses, of micro businesses. And those are the shapes of the three buses that you can ride. The one in blue is the government provided long bus, as they call it. Usually has 50 seats, and usually it's like a massive structure, 12 meters long by 3 meters high. Ownership is usually belonging to the central government, like public assets, or you can use the orange circle minibus, which is operated by the private sector, or you could use the microbus, which is operated by small businesses or micro businesses for this matter. Now, I'm making an argument here, like don't confuse my argument. I'm making an argument here that those microbuses themselves are a second tier structure. I'm not arguing that the drivers are individually, as individuals, second tier. I'm not arguing that they have second tier behavior, second tier consciousness. I'm arguing that they are functioning within a second tier system, like the systems that bind them and the systems that organize and regulate their actions are second tier and are quite aspirational in multiple ways, but the individuals themselves are not. And I'm not even arguing that we should transition those individuals into that level of consciousness. I'm not arguing that we should try and elevate their culture into that level of consciousness. I'm just arguing that the systems they function within evolved in such a way that it became a second tier system in which red individuals, in which power driven individuals can function productively. And that's a question that we're gonna delve in later on in the session. Can we have a second tier system within which red power driven individuals exist productively? Is that a possible aspiration? Is that a possible thing? Or is it a possible reality? Or does the system, or do the individuals have, like, do red individuals have to affect the system within which they function? Now, I have three reasons to argue that the system within the paratransit system within which they function is second tier. Now, I'm comparing between the three forms of transit: the government program on the left, which is blue, corporation provided, like many buses provided by large corporations, which is mainly orange, and micro businesses, which I am argue as second tier. The first reason is the management structure. The government provided long bus as managed as a blue hierarchy, where you'd have managers and bosses, bureaucrats, tenured bureaucrats who've been at the organization for a long while, and who give directions, who design routes, who do all of the direction. You'd have plenty of miscellaneous stuff from HR to finance to accounting, and the rest goes on. And you'd have multiple layers of middle management. It's a bit better in corporations where they're still bosses, but like they are business executives, not bureaucrats. There are miscellaneous stuff, but like it's a bit more modernized and a few layers of middle management. It's not as hectic as government programs, since those corporations are bound by generating profit, which is a very difficult thing to achieve. But when you look at micro businesses, when you look at those micro buses, you find that there are no bosses, there are no managers, no leaders of any kind. You buy your bus and you work on it, or you work on someone's bus and you pay rent for that bus. But like there aren't managers, there aren't HR, there aren't people to organize and to resolve conflict. These tasks, these jobs are distributed amongst the workers, the drivers themselves. Whenever a conflict arises, you'd find drivers themselves mediating to resolve that conflict. There aren't those many layers of middle management, which makes the industry quick and agile to respond to market trends. The second reason is bus ownership, or the ownership of the means of production. Now, government programs are usually it's like singular ownership, public assets that are bought and operated by the government, and that leads to a market failure risk of monopoly or taxpayer burden. Monopoly usually doesn't happen because the government uses public transportation as a way to gauge and to control its reputation and its popularity. So at times of elections and so, the fare usually goes down, and at normal times it keeps climbing, and the service there are usually more risks taken with service level at normal times. But this makes the whole government program become a tax burden on taxpayers, where the government has been operating around in Cairo, in Greater Cairo only, has been operating around 3,000 buses, and they're still making losses every single year. Every single year, although the public actually, there are tickets for those buses and the public actually pays for them, but till now, those buses cost the public more than they make them. Now, corporations are still centrally controlled, but they expose the public to a risk of oligopoly or monopoly as well. Which happens, it doesn't have to happen on the larger scale of the market. It could happen on the scale of specific routes. It happens that companies buy each other out of specific routes, so that the only way you can get from specific point A to specific point B is through a specific corporation, which then manages to raise prices and which you cannot really hold accountable to anyone. But if you look at microbuses, if you look at paratransit, you'd find that those micro businesses are pluralistic, and ownership means that they are employee owned, means that they are driver owned. Like most buses are owned by drivers themselves or by family members of the drivers. So the operation mechanism is decentralized. There isn't a central entity that owns the buses and operates them. Usually, you find a driver and his brother owning a single bus, working on it double shifts in the morning and shift in the evening. And the beautiful thing about this is that there is no market failure risk. A market that's dependent on micro businesses, a market that's dependent on hundreds of thousands of micro businesses, runs completely no market failure risk, as it's near impossible for those hundreds of thousands of businesses to coordinate between each other and to manipulate prices or manipulate routes and so on. More importantly, they are actually active taxpayers. They don't cost the public a penny, and they happen to be their fare happens to be cheaper actually than even the government run programs, because they allow a certain degree of flexibility in the prices, and their losses are very insignificant compared to government programs. where around 29% of buses are actually inoperational because of maintenance problems. So the micro business structure in bus ownership, because of it being decentralized, it runs no risk of market failure. The third reason that drives me to believe that micro businesses or the paratransit, decentralized mass transit, is second tier is the compensation scheme, the compensation plan in each of those three sectors. Now, in paratransit with microbuses, usually it's not called compensation. Usually the driver has a rental agreement with the bus owner if that driver is not the bus owner himself. So if the driver working on a bus doesn't own the bus they're working on, what they usually do is that they pay rent for the bus at the end of the day, compared to government buses that just pay drivers a fixed amount of like a fixed salary every month, plus insurance and so on, of course. And corporations which try to be a little bit more meritocratic, so they pay a fixed amount plus bonuses based on sales. Career progression in those government programs is tenure based. You spend more years, you earn more. In corporations, that's semi-meritocratic, where you progress in your career based on how committed you are to the bus you're working on, how much you're earning, how much attention you're paying to the bus. But in micro business, it's purely meritocratic, where there is no fixed salary. You progress in your career progression in this, and in the paratransit sector usually looks like this. You start as a driver, and then you save up, you buy your own bus, and then you save up, you buy perhaps another bus, perhaps then turn yourself from a micro business into a small business, and then some people actually manage to make it as medium-sized businesses. But career progression is purely bureaucratic. There isn't an element of work politics. There isn't an element of tenure. If you are committed, if you work 2 shifts a day, you'll achieve this goal in 3 years. If you work just 1 shift, you'll achieve it in 6 to 7 years. So usually the meritocratic nature of this sector offers drivers a great amount of flexibility, where if a driver's relative or if a driver's family member is sick, for example, they have the option of working double shifts in order to make up the healthcare costs of that family member. Whereas if you're working in the government and the family member of yours gets sick, you just have to take loans. Now, most importantly as well, the frequency of pay, of the frequency of compensation. Government programs and corporations are just like monthly salaries, like you get paid your monthly salary, but in micro businesses, you get paid instantly, which means that at the end of the day, you just have to pay rent, but what you get paid now, you can spend now. What you get paid now, like you don't have to wait till the end of the month. And this provides a massive, like a great deal of cash flow and convenience for those drivers, which is why at the end of the day in Cairo, which is the only city in Africa that has a metro system, an underground metro system, which serves around 5 million people every day, still microbuses are responsible of 52% of trips. So around 1 of every 2 transportation trips in Cairo is facilitated by paratransit. In Alexandria, that percentage grows to 92%, and almost everywhere else in Egypt, it's a pure 100%, where the only way for you to move from one place to the other, if you don't have a car and you're not renting a taxi, the only mass transit option available is paratransit. Now, while as this structure is great, it poses 3 difficult challenges. The first is digital payment. It poses like a specific big challenge, which is how do we introduce technology to a decentralized structure, meaning that there isn't a person on the top where you can sit with, make a deal with, and introduce technology layer by layer through that. There is a massive network of those buses. and Egypt has been on a very strong and quick trend of modernization, where the government and society in general has a goal of modernizing existing structures, especially transit. It's extremely difficult to introduce those three elements of digital payment, location tracking, and mediation. We've seen Uber succeed with that in the taxi industry, perhaps in a more disruptive manner, but like they succeeded to provide a means of digital payment, location tracking, and mediation. But that challenge gets to be much more difficult when you're working with mass transit, um, when you work in a sector that's highly price sensitive. Location tracking as well offers people the flexibility and the option to know where their bus is at what time. And mediation, it's not 100% technological, but like it needs a technological infrastructure in order for mediation to be possible, which is reporting drivers that break the standards and drivers also having the option to report uh, riders and give them reviews so those three challenges are what we try to work on, what we try to solve. Now I'm gonna give you a quick idea about our solution, Ogra. Okay, so the presentation in Arabic, but like I'll try to run you quickly through it. Ogra is a mobile wallet for micropayments. We basically help people pay for public transportation using their smartphones. Our model is a bit more complex than that, but let me give you a quick overview about the size of the problem. Those 6 coins, 6 pounds, are the average size of a single micropayment, the average bus fare. To put it in context, those are 100 pounds. If you change a banknote of 100 pounds, you get as many coins. Those are 10,000 pounds, an average salary of a mid-career person. And that's as many coins as gets to revolve in the Egyptian market every single minute. So it is a massive problem. It is a massive network. So basically, we help people pay digitally for their bus fares, so that they don't have to do so in cash, which is the digital payment element. Our app looks like this. People ride on the bus, they choose the line they're riding and the bus they're riding, and then drivers get on the bus, they top up their credit, and they pay for the bus fare. And drivers can use their app as well to track who has paid what and when. Now, there are so many details that I could talk about in our model, but basically speaking, for you to just get the grasp of it, yeah. So the way we facilitate it is our model is a bit different than the famous Uber model, which depends on investor money in order to finance fare subsidies on the fare for riders, and in order to incentivize drivers so that they can work more using the app. Our model is a bit different than that. We use outdoor advertising, we use the external surface of those buses, mini buses and microbuses and long buses as well, in order to finance bus subsidies. So briefly, we try to sell the external space on those buses as a marketing platform, and with the money of the rental money of those ad spaces, we subsidize the bus fare and we make digital payment possible. We've been working in this industry for a while, but the questions that I would like us to discuss right now are those two questions. I don't have the shortcut for making the thing. Yep. So first, is decentralized mass transit a good example of a second-tier system? I tried my best to make that argument. I clarified the 3 reasons of self-organizing teams, instant meritocratic pay, and distributed ownership. I do believe that it is a great example of a second-tier system, but that's something that I'd still like to discuss with you. And secondly, which is the challenge we're trying to address, is how can we actually introduce technology to a decentralized system? What is the way? How can we reach those people and convince them? How can we reach those red power-driven individuals and convince them to use an orange technology to make their lives easier and to increase their profit, perhaps? How do you expand that, and how do you manage it in the first place? Yeah, perhaps if anyone has like quick questions or clarifications about either of the prompts, and then we can move to just to make sure that everyone has it clear.
Steve has a question.
Yeah, just before we go into discussion, I just wanted to ask: are the microbuses regulated at all in any way? You know, for health and safety or that type of stuff.
Yeah, that's a great question. They are and they aren't. They are regulated for health and safety, and there are pretty strict standards. But in reality, estimates are there are for every one regulated bus, there are 3 unregulated buses. And the reason behind that isn't a lack of desire from the bus owners. It's more of government is trying to fight that sector. Government is trying to replace it with more centrally controlled sector. So they stopped issuing licenses in so many places. They stopped issuing licenses for microbuses some time ago. So there is a regulatory framework, but there's that kind of dynamic on the ground. There's that kind of struggle on the ground.
Thanks. Thank you.
Any other questions?
Khalid, what is your sense of, and I'm looking at this from a competitive standpoint, who do you consider to be the biggest competitor of this decentralized system, the government transit or the corporate microbuses or whatever you want to call them?
If we're asking this question with the standards of capitalism, which are those who make more profit expand more, and those who make less profit expand less, it will be the large corporates providing transit solutions, because they manage to make money at the end of the day, and they manage to expand, not as fast, but they do manage to expand. Many of them end up failing because this is a very tricky sector where the lines between profit and loss are very easy to cross. But the point is, the market doesn't really function with those rules right now because the government has its hand deep in the transportation sector. They're taking lots of loans to build more networks, and they quite often they wouldn't mind making losses if that improves their popularity. That's what it's like in a not too democratic system, but and like even in democratic systems, there are, like, the socialist school would say that public transportation is a public service and it has to lose money. So in this regard, the government has an upper hand in this, say, because not only they provide, they have the option of providing cheaper service, but they also have regulatory power over either paratransit or service offered by corporations. And currently licensed and regulated corporations or micro businesses, either paratransit or transit provided by large corporations, pay a hefty sum of licenses every year in order to just be able to operate their buses, and they pay that to the government, which is losing money on the other hand, competing with them. So the government is a bigger problem or a bigger competitor. I wouldn't call it competitor. I would call it more of a bigger challenge.
Yeah,
facing the sector.
Yeah, the government has the ability, you know, at a real simple level, if they want to de-emphasize the paratransit, they basically quadruple the license fees, which makes it harder and harder for that sector to function. Yeah, I get that.
But I don't know if I can say the good thing, but the good thing here is that the micro business nature of those of paratransit allows them to be quite agile. Like if you ever visit Egypt, you might see the scene of an informal station of microbuses. You'd see like around 15 microbuses or so lining, waiting for passengers to move. And then at the arrival and at the occasional arrival of police forces, they will all ride their buses and they will just move, they will run away. They're quite agile, which makes it extremely difficult for the government to actually shut them down or to fight them. And the dynamic now is the government is not issuing licenses, but still the sector is expanding. More and more people are buying buses, and more drivers are turning into owners by buying new buses. And the government doesn't have as much control to stop that sector. But what they have control over, what they can do is expand their existing official transportation network by building more metros, by buying more buses, by trying to compete with them more. But then they keep losing more and more money, and that exposes them to taxpayer pressure. Um, so, so they don't have the complete authority to shut the paratransit sector down right now, at least. Bet had a question?
I think Ben
Yeah,
had,
so you may have said this, but I forgot the numbers. Like, what percentage of people take the bus daily or weekly? And
Yeah.
what's the number? Like, is it, I don't know, give us some numbers so we have some perspectives.
Yeah, so Cairo and Egypt are actually, Egypt is actually heavily dependent on mass transit. That when Uber developed an Uber bus product, it pioneered it in Egypt. Like it started that product in Egypt. The numbers are, it's 90 something percent. I can get you the number from our books, but like it's 90 something percent of people actually use mass transit, like mass transit in general, not just paratransit, like use paratransit, depend on paratransit daily. And of those 90 something percent, I think it was 92, not quite sure, I can check that for you, but it was 90 something percent. Of those 90 something percent in Cairo, just in Cairo, half of them use paratransit and the other half use either government provided metro or the services provided by large corporations. It's mainly the metro, but yeah, that's what it looks like. Outside Cairo and Alexandria, the proportion is much more towards paratransit and much more away from personal vehicles, cars, and taxis, and so. So yeah, that's what the sector looks like. It's a massive industry and a massive sector. But currently, paratransit is pretty much the reality in most of Egypt. Even in Cairo, where the government spends around 94% of its transportation budget, still paratransit facilitates more than half mass transit trips. So as the reality. Veronica?
Yeah. So if I lived in Cairo, why would I catch one of these buses rather than a standard government bus? And how do I know where the bus is going if it's not like a regular route? If it's because I have this image of this unmarked bus that they're going to kidnap you and take you to some warehouse. So why am I going to get in that bus?
Yeah, that's a great question. They're usually much more reliable, and because of their smaller size and smaller cost, their frequency is much higher. So usually you wouldn't have to wait for the bus. You just go to the street, to the bus stop, and you find a bus passing in front of you. Now, the safety challenge, there have been a few incidents in new desert cities, new desert communities that are being built at the borders of Cairo. But as a challenge, and as I was saying, it's one problem that this decentralized sector faces, which is the need for mediation. I have to point out though that this is not a frequent problem. It's not something that happens often. Um, it might be something that happens much more often in other cities or other countries that don't have as much rule of law. We don't have that much rule of law, but like we have a good amount that this accident isn't frequent. But yes, there is a need for mediation. There is a need for a mediator. The government is trying currently to fill that gap by itself, trying to be that mediator. But they're not doing enough of a job because they don't have the technological infrastructure, and they don't have. You could say they don't have the right protocols. Um, but yeah, actually, many people who could afford that avoid the whole mass transit thing and choose to use taxis or Uber for fear of their safety. In my circles, however, I don't know of someone who does this. As for the routes, the buses usually have like it's usually written in the front of either microbuses, minibuses, or big buses. Like once you see the bus, you can actually identify where it's going and where it's coming from.
Okay, thank you.
Just I'm trying to get an idea of what the competitive situation is there.
Mhm.
And I'm also trying to think in terms of how can I answer both questions. How can we modernize a decentralized system, and is a decentralized system second tier? And I guess I'll speak primarily to the modernized question by asking a couple questions. One, one observation that I had when you showed that your photo of that traffic jam in Cairo that had a bus, had a government bus, a corporate bus, and then some minibuses. I guess the first thing that came to my mind was, if you view transportation as more than just a way to get from point A to point B, but how fast can you get from point A to point B? I can't see there's any competitive advantage in terms of how fast in any of those. I mean, you're in a traffic jam. A bus is going to wait. Corporate microbus is going to wait. A privately owned minibus is going to wait. So are there ways of looking at, what competitive advantage can you bring to the marketplace that go
Certainly.
beyond just getting from point A to point B and getting there and being able to claim faster? And then my second part of this, which kind of gets to the decentralized second tier issue, is there a system, recognizing that the drivers or the owners or whatever of the decentralized system, are the individually are more red and blue? Is there a system that proactively allows them to kind of periodically talk to each other, share successes, failures, and to, even though it's not centralized, even though they're not managed by anybody, is there a way for them as an informal group to problem solve?
Yep. I think I got both your questions. So for the first question about the competitive advantage, microbuses do have a competitive advantage. They are way faster and way more agile than either minibuses or long buses, government provided long buses. And even in a traffic, like some people argue that actually the big buses cause more traffic issues than either microbuses or minibuses, for the simple reason that like imagine a roundabout, or imagine a U-turn. For one of those long buses to actually go the other way and use that U-turn, it will have to block traffic. It will have to block the entire road for a few minutes. Like the picture we're looking at is from a traffic stop, actually. Like it's in perhaps the most important square in Egypt, where people actually do follow traffic lights and the rules are heavily enforced in this place. So this traffic isn't natural, it's induced by traffic lights. But at the end of the day, people actually prefer, if you're trying to get from point A to point B faster, you use a microbus because it's quicker to fill, which means it will stop less frequently, and it's also a smaller vehicle, which means it can get through tighter spaces and it will be way quicker than the alternatives. So it has a competitive advantage. Moreover, its fare is actually distance-based. So if you ride from point A to point B, you pay X. If you ride from point A to point B, then point C, if you ride a larger distance, you pay 2X. But then for public buses, the fare is usually fixed at 2X, like you just pay 2X. And the reason behind that is the government is trying to track payment through tickets. So there are tickets that are being issued when you pay the bus fare. In a big bus, you get a ticket, but in a small bus, you do not get a ticket because it's unnecessary overall. But those tickets make it extremely inconvenient and extremely difficult to have different levels of fare. So overall, microbuses are faster and are cheaper and are as well more environmentally friendly. Now, as for the second question of how the community gets together and how, like whether there is a space for the drivers to convene and to reflect and to kind of grow, there are that kind of spaces, which are the stations, and those drivers exist in communities actually. If you compare buses, for example, with convenience stores are separated by geography, so they don't usually exist in communities. They don't know each other. But the buses, at the end of the day, they convene every day and they talk and they network and they problem solve in those communities. That's why this sector managed to expand and managed to create more and more routes out of itself. So without central leadership, without a visionary leader that believes that this new city requires a line from central downtown so as to serve people working in the factory there, like without the need for actually people who have that vision and who understand that sector managed to expand by self-interested parties who are trying to run away from their competition, like the inter-competition with other microbuses, and are trying to expand their businesses. And while as I said that the drivers are power-driven red individuals, usually they transition and they grow into blue once they start turning into owners, not just drivers. So you're a driver, you're power-driven, you don't care much about the safety of the bus. But then as you grow older and you start to save money and you buy your own bus and you try to grow your business, if you are an owner driver, you're usually more blue. And if you look at a bus station in Cairo, the scene of drivers having conflicts and fighting over riders is actually quite common. You'd find drivers arguing about whose turn is whose driver, like whose turn is to move and to get riders. And usually the people mediating to solve those conflicts are owner drivers or other drivers in the same network, in the same station, who own buses and who have it in their interest to maintain peace and stability. So those dynamics actually have to happen, and that kind of development journey from red to blue and even to orange for the few ones who manage to expand their business and buy more and more buses, and like perhaps some reach to a dozen buses or so, and expand their business and hire more drivers. But like that kind of development dynamic gets to happen. That kind of personal development dynamic gets to happen between drivers and owner drivers. Did I answer your questions?
Yeah, yeah. The reason I asked the second question is that, the way you described the decentralized paratransit system, I mean, it sounds very much like, a complex adaptive system. I mean, it's not, it and in terms of they complex adaptive systems have real advantages in terms of being able, if they function well, if they function as that, they have incredible competitive advantage. And I asked the question to see are the communications platforms or abilities in place that would allow that system to more effectively operate as a complex adaptive system.
Yeah, like you'd even see a scene of drivers communicating with each other through phones. Like you'd be riding with a driver, with a paratransit driver, and once they had a roadblock, once they had like a point of traffic, you'll find them calling other drivers in the network and informing them that there is a roadblock in this particular area, or there is a police stop or something in this particular area, so that they'd avoid it. Communication is quite instant and quite effective between them, and as a matter of fact, and that's actually how they manage to keep evading authorities, and that's actually how the government hasn't been able to forcefully shut them down, and are having to make compromise after the other in order to save the massive costs of shutting such a sector down. Steve, I know you've been waiting for a while.
I wanted to ask, in terms of the government trying to clamp down on this paratransit sector, given that the whole country is so heavily dependent on it, really, what's their narrative, or what do you think is their motivation or thinking behind why they're clamping down?
It's a great question. They can't control it. They simply can't control it. They can influence it in multiple ways. Like currently, the government is actually taking it upon itself to define the bus fare. So when you ride a bus and you pay, say, £4, you're paying £4 because the government say that you should pay £4. And recently, in the last few years in Egypt, there has been multiple changes, and the government used to subsidize oil, used to subsidize gas, and then it kept lifting those subsidies little by little. So this caused a bit of instability in the fare, for example. So the government actually used its police force to enforce the new fare, because like they changed the fare as well. The government used its authority and its forces to enforce this fare, but going as far as totally crushing them down and canceling them, so to speak, wouldn't be. It would be quite expensive. What they're trying to do, which is actually effective and which wouldn't harm anybody at the end of the day, is that they're taking lots of loans to expand the existing metro system, the existing metro network. They're building a monorail, they're building new rail networks, they are easing down the regulatory framework for corporations and reducing the license amount for large corporations, which is helping that sector expand a bit more. They're also trying to buy new buses for their government-run programs, but at the end of the day, many of the corporations specifically end up failing. The government isn't very good at running the metro system either. Recently, they started a lease program with a private sector company to run part of our metro network. So it's now part of the metro network is run by a private sector company because the government could not generate enough profits from it. The government just couldn't manage it properly. So they're trying from both ways, but like it's not getting to be enough. But at the end of the day, if they succeeded to expand the metro network, that will help the market overall because it will expand the city overall, which will in turn it will move those drivers to other routes, but those other routes will exist because of the network system. I personally don't expect them to succeed in crushing microbuses completely. Especially that they are not able to generate profit. Like the government is focused heavily on giving independence to government institutions, including the government-run transit programs, and institutions that are just too much of a burden end up getting privatized and sold out. And government-run transportation programs have always been such a burden. They're not able to commercialize themselves quite well for multiple reasons. Regulatory reasons and bureaucratic reasons, but at the end of the day, that's what they're doing, and that's why it's not working.
I just wondered if I was missing something, because are you saying it's just an instinctive reaction from the government to want to control, or is, because it doesn't seem rational that they, you know, when the whole country is so dependent on this sector, that they should really try and inhibit in any way? But it could be just an instinctive reaction. They're trying to control it, or is there something I'm missing? Like, is there big tax evasion, or is there big health and safety problems? You know, what?
The health and safety problems aren't significant at all, actually. Tax evasion could be something similar to that. As I told you a few minutes earlier, most of those buses are not licensed. They're essentially a huge part of the non-formal economy, and the government has a problem with that non-formal economy because it can't reach it. It can't take taxes from it, it can't take licenses from it. So they're trying. They have similar efforts across multiple industries, across different industries. They're just trying to limit or kill the non-formal sector. Not everyone in the government is trying to shut down microbuses completely, and many people are actually trying to regulate them and are trying to welcome them in the circle of official regulated entities, but they have a huge problem with it being decentralized. They have a huge problem with it, with paratransit being completely out of government control. So it's been great having this discussion and like the questions that followed it. It's a challenge that we are facing ourselves with Ogra, with the fintech company we're running, and it's a real life situation where you can see spiral dynamics applying in action on the ground. I'd love to get comments or questions about whether you agree or disagree that this sector is a field organization according to Frederick Laloux's description, or a second tier organization according to spiral dynamics. And it's been quite a lot of fun. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Khalid.